Today I'd like to continue my series on the Caro Kann. So the first time we sort of saw a little bit of an introduction on the key strategical points, some of the lines that white can try, and we went over some of the sidelines. So today we're going to move on to one of the more main lines, but I still is not super common, and that is the fantasy variation. And I believe this is the best way to do things. Start by learning the sidelines first because, well, a lot of people play sidelines, and main lines are easier to learn anyway, so you might as well beat the bad ones. So e4, c6, d4, d5. So white plays the move f3. Now, in a lot of sense, I have a lot of respect for this variation because it's a very principled line. The whole principle, white is saying to black, look, your moves, they have some logic to them, but they're not quite looking to occupy the center the way mine are. I played e4 and d4. You only played like one of yours was c6. So I'm going to do my best to really maintain this center. And as a result, he plays the very principled move f3, trying to take the whole cake, essentially. Although, as we're going to see, there are certain drawbacks to this move. And he's sort of trying to test black immediately. And I think that, there's a lot of moves here. White is certainly making some concession by opening up this long diagonal and precluding the knight from ever developing to the f3 square. And black has some options. I've seen him play queen b6 here. This is a pretty common move. I've seen him play e6 and knight f6. These are all reasonable. But the move I want is also one of principle, which says if white is going to open up his kingside pawn structure and not develop his pieces, I want to attack him right away. And we're going to do just that. So we're going to start by exchanging on e4, which looks like a concession because it's really giving white a huge pawn center and opening up this f3 square for the knight. Indeed, if black were to play passively here, e6 or g6, after knight f3 already, I think you have a very unpleasant position. But I'm going to recommend immediately striking back in the center with the move e5. So the point of this move is that we're trying to fight back on the white center, open up lines for our pieces, and we're also incidentally threatening the move queen to h4 check. So of course d takes e5, queen h4, white's already losing actually. So that would be bad news for white. Instead, he should play the move knight f3, which puts pressure on e5, protects d4, and controls queen h4. Now, e takes d4 is, I would argue, the most principled move here, but I think after bishop c4, white's initiative is a bit too strong for us. He's going to castle very quickly, and f7 looks like a point of conquest. So I'd recommend something other than this. There are a couple options here that I think are quite reasonable. I'm not going to go too much into the first one, which is bishop e6, but I would, if somebody ever wants an alternative to the line that I'm going to suggest, I think this is a very good one. The idea is we're immediately controlling that key c4 square, and white still can't really capture the pawn very comfortably. So if he takes with the knight after queen h4, there's major problems. And if he takes with the pawn, he does stay up a pawn, but his structure is very unfortunate. And black will simply develop his pieces all to good squares, and he has good counterplay against the doubled, isolated white e-pawns, and white's down in development. So I think this is absolutely fine for black. And probably white should play a move like c3. And, I'd recommend you guys do some study on this on your own, especially if you want an alternative to the line I'm going to give you. So I'm going to leave it at that, and mostly move on to bishop g4. So this is the move that I recommend. It's a very aggressive move. It's allowing white to play bishop c4 with tempo, but I think that it's also totally fine for black. So black has a very natural developing scheme that we're going to see. So I actually covered a game in this line already a while ago against Grandmaster Ray Robson, who's doing very well these days. He actually just won a nice game today that I saw, which went bishop c4, knight d7, and then I'm just going to quickly play through the moves to show you the general black setup. c3, bishop h5, castle, knight f6, knight bd2, bishop d6. Don't worry, we're going to go much slower than this in a second. And here we've essentially gotten to the meat of black's setup, which shows he wants to put his knights on f6 and d7, bishop on d6, and he's going to want to castle, play rook e8, and queen c7. So, if I were just to make random moves for white, I'm not gonna, bishop d3, castle, all this was played, I think, queen e1, rook e8. Here, black has reached his ideal setup. White has two pawns in the center compared to black's one, but black's one pawn in the center is doing just as good a job, I think, and he's ready to open the e-file at any moment to put pressure on the center, and I think already, because black's pieces are so well and so firmly controlling the e5 square, white actually already found himself in some trouble in this game. And for example, I remember everyone was suggesting knight c4 here, but already after knight c4, knight c5, white's, I think, close to losing because pawns are going to start falling in the center and the tactics are favoring black. So, in general, I think that this setup is extremely good. And, okay, I'll show one more idea there. Basically, that setup is what we're aiming for. But white has a few different tricks and tries with different move orders to try to prevent us from getting that setup or allowing it and then trying to break it down. So we're going to look at all those. Remember now, that key setup we just saw was knight f6, knight d7, bishop d6, castle, and rook e8. Now, I should have left it up for longer. I actually misclicked, but you can go back to that moment and pause it if you want to see the sort of setup black's shooting for. So white has a few options to work with. There's one c3, which I think actually makes a lot of sense, but we're going to come back to that later because I'm going to show you why. In any case, the most natural move, which I actually don't think is best, but most people are playing, is bishop to c4. Now, we have to be very ginger about which way we decide to order our moves. If we play a move like knight to f6, already white has some unpleasant move for you to deal with here, so I'll give you guys a chance to see if you can find it. Alright, so white's best move is bishop takes f7 check, and with some tricks, black ends up in serious trouble, because after king takes f7, knight takes e5 check, white takes a second pawn, and with a fork, he recovers his bishop on g4, with an extra pawn and a huge attack. So black needs to defend the e5 square with knight d7, and now white has a couple possibilities here, but I think the trickiest one is c3. If he castles, I think simply knight f6 is your best move, and black will have a fine position. I think he'll be able to set up his bishop d6 very quickly. So let's say instead white plays the better move, which is c3. Now, black has to be a little careful, because if he plays knight f6 here, I think that after queen b3 there are going to be some problems. That pawn on f7 becomes a real target. So you could play bishop h5, and now white has a choice to make. He can take on b7, which I think is unclear, but I think even stronger is simply to castle. And the problem is taking on b7 is now really a threat. The reason it wasn't as much before was because after some kind of like bishop takes f3 and, well, there's some like knight takes e4 stuff going on, and, well, the white king becomes problematic. But after castle short, I think that black can find himself in some trouble. If he plays a move like bishop d6, I think now we can get away with taking this guy. So we'd have to do something about him, and b5 would be the natural solution. But after bishop to e2, then there's some problems because white will quickly play a4. For example, bishop d6, a4, and I think white has good chances for an advantage here. The main point being that if black plays a6 after we exchange these pawns, rook a8, queen a8, after all this takes, white has this move rook f5 at the end, which is really annoying. In any case, that's sort of a long variation that doesn't have a huge degree of relevance to us, but I think that it could be really annoying. So I'm going to recommend sort of a tricky move here with bishop to h5. And now the point is we're going to meet queen b3 with b5 directly. And now after bishop e2, we can do things a little bit differently. For example, we can play bishop d6 first, or we can even consider moves like taking on d4 and playing c5. But I would recommend playing bishop h5 first to avoid queen b3. Among other things, white did have the option of taking on b7, so that's just something you want to avoid. In any case, after bishop h5, I don't think white will play queen b3 here. It looks kind of nonsensical. Black doesn't even have to play b5. He has other moves as well there. But white will castle. Now knight gf6. And white has a few options here. we're going to get our setup. This much is clear at this point. But the real question is, how does white want to hurt us in this setup or try to pose problems to us? So he has three options. One, he can play knight bd2 right away, which is what Robson played against me. This is not good at all. He can play bishop e3 first, or he can play bishop g5. I think bishop g5 is the most challenging. So let's go with the least challenging first. If knight bd2, we simply get our setup, and white doesn't really have any hope to create counterplay. So black is simply better. For example, let's say queen e1, castle, and already it seems to me that black has an extremely good position because white is not organizing any kind of kingside play, and black will very quickly play rook e8 and generate play in the center. For example, if white ever plays queen h4, black will respond with bishop g6, and now suddenly the e4 pawn is under pressure. Like, if white were to play a random move, I think black can already capture it, because it doesn't matter that it's protected twice, because we're going to exchange the queens first and capture back on e4. So white would have to do something like rook e1 to protect the pawn, and now rook e8. And the real problem is this e4 pawn is just under so much pressure that it's very likely to simply fall. And that would leave white with a highly compromised situation. So, like in the game, Robson played bishop d3, but after just castles, queen e1, rook e8, he couldn't play knight c4 because of knight c5. We already saw this. So really, though, how does he ever develop his c1 bishop and get him into the game? Robson decided to play king h1. The point behind knight c4, knight c5 is that if this knight is captured after bishop takes c5, we have a check, and we're uncovering an attack on the d3 bishop. So after king h1, white sort of is quote-unquote threatening knight c4, not that it would do that much. But black simply retreats with bishop c7, and now, again, knight c4 would fail to knight c5, which would win the e4 pawn. So white played bishop c2 to get out of the way of knight c5 and finally hope to get knight c4. But here, black has been making natural moves that sort of put pressure on the center, while white's been playing queen e1, king h1, bishop c4 to d3 to c2. So it's no surprise that a simple opening of the center after e takes d4 and c5 leaves white in huge problems, because d5 is impossible on account of knight takes d5, and there's no way for white to keep his center intact. So he's going to end up with a weak, isolated e-pawn, and that's exactly what happened. The pawn quickly fell, and black ended up winning the game. In any case, this was not at all what white wants. Much better option is to develop the bishop first. So you can play bishop e3, but I don't think this is quite as good. After we simply continue our plan, castle, I think black has a totally fine position. And he'll play rook e8 just as normal. He won't be able to put the same kind of pressure on white's position with this bishop on e3 as he was without, but I think that he is a fine position, and he also can consider a move like knight g4 someday. So this strikes me as totally fine for black. But the most challenging is bishop to g5, which is definitely trying to really restrict the black pieces and put pressure on the knight on f6. So here, by playing bishop g5, he's also sort of protecting e4 by making this knight on f6 unable to move. In any case, there's a lot of moves that have been played here. I know that there was some recommendation by, I think, Gawain Jones, that said queen b6 here, which forces the win of a pawn on either b2 or e4. But this looks extremely risky to me. I believe that white will get too much play for this pawn, and I don't want any piece of that. Or maybe it was another position where without c3. In any case, I think white should play c3 here, because I think c3 is a move he always wants to play. And if he doesn't play c3 here, black will continue a strategy like, let's say, castle, knight f6. If he plays c3 now after bishop d6, queen b3 castles will not do anything for white. So I think that he should play c3 to try to force bishop h5, which is a useful move, but the question is it actually as useful as a move like knight f6 or bishop d6? In any case, let's go back to the position at hand. So here, Jones was suggesting queen b6 or something like that, but I don't believe it. I would prefer to continue our solid plan. So I want to play the move bishop to d6 here, continuing our setup. I don't think there's any serious reason not to. Let's say white plays knight bd2, we castle. I think black has a totally fine position here, and I'm ready to stand by that. Now, the real thing that sort of got me thinking was when I tried to figure out what white's plan here was. Ultimately, I decided that bishop c4 was developing a piece with a gain of tempo, but when it came down to it, this bishop on c4 is misplaced. We want to put the knight there. So I think the best move in this position is something like bishop d3. And that's why, going back, I think bishop c4 is not the best move, and we're going to cover that in a second. But here, after bishop d3, black has a few options, but I think the easiest is just b5. Keeping the c4 score under control. Whenever white plays a4, black will play a6. And black has sort of the simple plan of queen c7, rook fe8, and he should have a totally fine position. He has his control of the center, and he's very solid, and he's got his own stuff to play for. So, like, make an example, let's say, I don't know, b4, queen c7, a4, a6. Seems like black's pretty solid. Knight b3, rook fe8. And I think both sides have their chances in this position. Black has pressure on the white center. White has a little bit more space. All black's pieces are doing fine, though. In fact, actually here, probably black had some kind of e takes d4, bishop takes h2 combination. So white might have to avoid that first with, like, queen e1, rook fe8, maybe some kind of queen h4. In any case, I think the position's unclear, and there's good chances for both sides. And this is exactly the kind of position we want when we play the Caro Kann. So I think that's what we should do if white plays his best setup against our setup. And I believe the position's about equal. In any case, I'd like to go back towards the beginning of the game and cover the move c3 here, which looks a little silly, but I think it actually is very logical. And the point is that white wants to support d4, because if you played a sort of nonchalant move like bishop d3, I think maybe here black would take on d4. Because there's no more like bishop c4 with death the same way, at least. So I don't think that's a concern. But c3 is sort of the main one. And the point here, white wants to play bishop to d3 or bishop to e2. Bishop c4 looked nice, but realistically, white was never able to put serious pressure on f7. So what I would prefer to do is to put pressure on e5. Either by playing bishop d3 to protect the e4 pawn and then swing his knight to c4, or by playing bishop e2, which will break the pin on the knight on f3. So black has a few options here, but the one I'm going to recommend is knight to f6, putting immediate pressure on e4. I don't think bishop d3 is so great for white. Black probably should capture on d4, give a check on b4, and he'll simply castle, and I think he'll have a fine position. White also has to be careful what he plays here. If he plays something like knight c3, I think black can take the bait and start capturing pawns. So, yeah, that's got to be fine for black. In any case, white might play a move like e5 instead. And here I'd recommend just knight d5, takes, bishop b4 check again. And black will castle short, and his pieces all have found good squares. White's got a little bit more central space, but black can try to break that down. I think this is an absolutely fine position for black. And, I think you can be happy playing it. So, I think the most challenging move for white is to play bishop to e2, with the intention of meeting knight takes e4 with knight takes e5. And I think here, actually, white could have a more pleasant position. And again, at this point, I'm going to recommend the grab the bull by the horns strategy and capture on d4 directly. So, white could play e5, and this will get to a pretty similar situation. Black has a choice between knight e4 and knight d5. He can even try the move d3, which I think makes some sense to try to dislodge the white bishop and prevent white from achieving a really nice pawn structure. However, this is a bit risky on account of taking on f6 and taking on e2. And I mean, I couldn't find anything super convincing for white here, but obviously it's going to have some risk involved. So, I think this is okay, but, you have been warned. In any case, I think a move like knight d5 or knight e4, followed up by something like bishop b4 check, should again lead to a fine position for black. Because he's got all his pieces on active squares, and his, white's got a little bit more pawn space, but it doesn't really matter. Space doesn't matter much if you've got all your pieces on good squares, and black can hope to break down the white center with, like, c5, knight c6 someday, or f6. So I think this is fine for black. The best move for white is knight takes d4. And now, after bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, black's actually under a little bit of pressure here, because white has the very simple plan of playing e5, e6, and giving checkmate. But luckily for us, I think it's not as bad as it looks. Black should play bishop c5 to put pressure on this knight. White plays e5. Knight d5. Now e6 I don't think is going to be very effective. Probably black's easiest is to simply take the knight and castle, and it looks like black is absolutely fine. Note that white can't take on f7, because after king takes f7, if he gives a check somewhere with the queen, let's say, we'll block with the bishop. Same if he plays rook f1. And if he takes here after rook e8, black wins. So white really will have to take this guy back. And now black simply castles, and it looks to me like black has a totally fine position. White's underdeveloped. He's got the isolated queen pawn, and if black's not getting mated in the next two moves, which I think he is not, then black might even have good chances for an advantage. So, well, here white should play queen g4. And this is actually kind of a tricky moment. Black has to find some good moves to hang on, but it's not too difficult. The best move, I think, is knight to e7. If castles, which is natural after bishop h6, white wins material, so we don't want that. But I think knight e7 is a good move. The basic plan is you're rerouting the knight to g6, and if white takes on g7 after rook g8, queen h7, and say, like, takes, the question is who's attacking who. White's pieces are still stuck on the back rank. Black's temporarily down a pawn, but he's hitting g2, he's hitting e5. He's going to play knight d7 and castle along very quickly. I think that black has an extremely dangerous attack here. I don't think white can really get away with taking that pawn. So knight e7 is a good move. And, okay, let's see, I don't know, castles. This looks like a totally fine position for black. Castle short is feasible. I think this looks good. Bishop h6, knight g6, and I think black has a fine position. So, in any case, that's, like, let's say, like, I don't know, maybe I'll continue the line a little bit. Knight e4 is something, and now they're playing, I think queen d5 is a good move. Knight e4. And bishop takes d4 check, takes. And it looks like black is escaping after something like king h8. Queen takes e5 was maybe possible as well. In any case, I think this is the best move, but this knight e7 move is very important, because without that I do think white could get a dangerous attack. After e6, g6, white can quickly castle. He'll organize bishop h6, e6, and start to attack, or bishop g5, knight d2, knight e4. But this knight e7 move really holds the fort down, and I think it leaves black with a quite good position. So, in any case, with all this in mind, I think that you guys should be feeling pretty comfortable about the fantasy variation. Of course, feel free to go through this video again to try to keep everything in touch. But hopefully you've found a way that will give you a decent position and good dynamic chances. And I've also, without actually covering them, suggested a few alternatives along the way if somehow this isn't to your liking, although I hope it is.